My name is Barry Minkow. At age 16, I started a ZZZ carpet and furniture cleaning company, and by the time I was 20, it was worth well over $240 million in a hot stock on Wall Street. There was only one problem with the company and me. We were both frauds.
At the age of 16, Barry Minkow started a carpet cleaning service in his garage. It never made a legitimate profit, so he decided to cook the books. Within 5 years, his scheme had unraveled, and he was sentenced to 25 years in prison for defrauding investors of over $100 million. For the first time, Minkow talks about what he did and why.
Well, basically the fraud was, we had a carpet, furniture, and drapery cleaning that was legitimate. We owed a lot of money to a lot of people, borrowed to expand on the way up. I couldn't get bank loans a lot very easily. And I got caught up in paying usurious loans, borrow from Peter to pay Paul. And in the process of getting caught in those usurious loans, I got myself in debt and began to perpetrate a restoration fraud. A fraud that would say that I'm making more money than I'm really making, and I need to borrow more money than I really would need to borrow if my company were legitimate. So I needed what we call a built-in excuse. Why are you always short of money? I got these restoration jobs. And I had to fool accountants and auditors into believing that those numbers were real before I could perpetrate that fraud.
Since Minkow was in the red from the start, he borrowed money constantly wherever he could. He used phony financials to borrow as much as he could from banks. When his credit ran out, Minkow owed so much that the only thing that would save him was to go public with a stock offering. To explain why he needed so much money, he told his auditors and lawyers that he also restored buildings damaged by fire and flood. To show income, he created phony customers. And to cover his debt payments, he created phony expenses.
What I did was I created false vendors like Marble Marketing or Tough Techs, and created invoices and created literal front companies who I could show money going to.
Although he never had an accounting class in his life, he knew the importance of receivables.
Well, accounts receivable are a wonderful thing. They are a tool that is used by a fraudster like me to ask to borrow money, mainly, and to show earnings. So I can borrow money, hey, I need the money, look at these receivables, and I can show earnings, because once you book the receivable, you're already counting for the income, and you're showing earnings. So what I need to do is create a receivable, and because I had this company that we were doing these insurance frauds from, and I had their letterhead, I could make up any letter and any invoice to say that they owed me money for doing this job. I could take some checks in the past and say that they were supplies for the job, and I could piecemeal it together, the detail stuff along the way. Bingo, I have a receivable.
Minkow also knew the two tests auditors use for accounts receivable: confirmation with the customer and subsequent payment of the receivable.
One way you cannot dispute a receivable if it's been paid. If I have a $500,000 receivable from Interstate Appraisal Services, and it was supposed to be net 60, and on day 58, I have a $500,000 check to show them, how can they not book that? How can they doubt that? So something that they used to try to detect the fraud actually worked in my favor, because I was a paperwork manufacturing machine. You take the checkbook of the phony setup company, Interstate Appraisal Services. So you take a check, you got an invoice 7727, $300,000, net 60. You got a check that says 7727, job well done, check's there. Here's the check, and I tie in a $300,000 deposit off the bank statement that was deposited on the same date that check dates. There's the deposit. Really, the deposit was to do a kite. But it tied together so nicely, what do they know?
What the auditors didn't know was that Minkow's restoration business, which comprised over 80% of his earnings, was completely phony. So to avoid detection, Minkow steered his auditors and lawyers to the legitimate part of his business.
You know, the restoration business was maybe 80% of the income that I earned, allegedly. But 80% of the due diligence that I tried to get the auditors and the lawyers to look at was the carpet cleaning end of the business, which was legitimate. But I think the final touch was, well, the kids on Wall Street, if there was something wrong, somebody would have found it by now. And they see a media figure, they see a Ferrari in the house, and the guy's got to have money. Well, the Ferrari's leased and the house is mortgaged to the hilt, but what do they know?
Public accounting is a competitive business. Barry Minkow knew that and used it to his advantage.
And so they're in competition with one another, and their competition is what you leverage. I can't remember how many times, Larry, I just know Coopers and Lybrand would love this account. Does he want to go back to his clients and the manager and everybody and say that they lost the ZBest account because they wanted to be petty, because they set the ground rules and we abided by them? Do they want to lose the ZBest account? No, they don't want to lose the ZBest account, and I leverage that to the hilt too. So you got to remember something. Yes, you want to get to know your client, but you want to maintain your objectivity, and I believe the auditor's responsibility is to give up the $100,000 a year fee to prevent the $16 million fraud.
Indeed, it was a fraud. Minkow says the key to uncovering his schemes was to understand what he was doing at his banks.
I had burned, literally, probably 6 banks at the time the auditors wanted to do business with me. The banks failed to give them the necessary information they needed to determine what kind of person I was, to my advantage.
Minkow also knew how to confirm banking relationships.
If they're going to mail a confirmation to the bank, fine. We don't care what it says our balance is, our average balance is, and how much we owe. That wasn't where the fraud was happening. The fraud was happening with 3 banks, kiting checks back and forth, inflating a false balance. The loan payment, heck, if you make a loan payment, what's the problem there? And there's just no accountability. It's the auditors are being cheated, I believe, by the banks not getting enough information from them.
Joe Dominic wrote a book about Barry Minkow called Faking It in America. Dominic takes a more sinister view of why Minkow's fraud wasn't detected.
But nobody, I think, was looking too hard. Nobody suspected to find anything, but nobody wanted to look too hard because everybody was making money. The lawyers were making a lot of money. The accountants were making a lot of money. The underwriters were going to make a lot of money. So nobody wanted to look too hard. An additional aspect of it that made it succeed was that it was so audacious. I'll never forget Tom Paget telling me this, that for something this audacious, this big and audacious to happen, we would have had to do what we did. And nobody believed that somebody would do that, would go to the lengths that they went to.
Ironically, Minkow's fraud wasn't detected by auditors.
As he became more and more famous, as he became the boy wonder, people who he had scammed in these petty minor ways started to make some noise.
The noise came from a Los Angeles housewife. One of Minkow's many tricks to raise money was to overcharge customers who put carpet cleaning services on a credit card. If they complained, he would eventually return their money. If not, he'd keep it. This particular housewife couldn't understand why Minkow, the boy wonder, wouldn't refund her money. She finally called a local newspaper reporter who discovered that Minkow had cheated hundreds of customers in the same way. Within days of printing an expose, the price of ZBest stock had fallen through the floor. And when the dust had settled, the assets of Minkow's $240 million company were sold for less than $50,000. The bubble had burst.
Without putting the pressure on the auditors, you got to pull yourself away from the numbers. And hindsight's wonderful, to look back, and everybody says, how could you have been fooled by Barry Minkow? How could anyone have fallen for the old fraudulent building restoration scam or an old Ponzi scheme? Well, very easily. The press says I'm gold. The banks said I was gold. I had Hughes, Hubbard & Reed as my lawyers. I was doing well on Wall Street. And I leveraged my auditors by saying, you don't want to be the only one, the only non-believer, do you?
Is ZBest an aberration? Not according to Barry.
You know probably how many Barry Minkows there are out there right now? A lot.